So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel. I have the immense privilege of being the CEO of Climate Outreach. And we are here this morning to talk you through the findings of our report, Britain Talks Climate and Nature, which we published yesterday. The report, which you will find on our website now, has a huge amount of kind of detail and insight based on the best part of a year of kind of research. You will also find a new communications toolkit, which is a tool that we hope you can use to put all of these insights and findings into practice in your day-to-day work. If you have further questions, if you would like further help and support with implementing some of these recommendations or using some of the insights, please get in touch with us. We'd love to come and talk you through the findings in more detail, to tailor that to your organisation and your needs, and to run some workshops to help you put these findings into practice in your day-to-day work. There's a huge amount of depth of knowledge and data and insight in the report, and we're going to try and talk you through some of the really kind of key findings this morning. But if you leave today with just kind of one kind of key takeaway, we hope that it is this. For everybody who is passionate about tackling climate change, about protecting nature, you need to know that people really do care more than you think. But we are now at a time where we urgently need to kind of up our game if we don't want to risk losing them. We were very fortunate yesterday. We launched this research at an in-person event where we were joined by Ed Miliband, the Secretary of State, and he was pretty clear. He said, we're in a fight now. And what we hope that we're able to provide with Britain Talks Climate and Nature are some really up-to-date, in-depth insights to help us feel more confident in that fight. It's not a fight any of us, I think, wanted to be in, but now that we're here, it's, I think, thinking about how we can kind of collectively step up to build on the immense progress that we have already made together. So just in terms of a plan for the next kind of hour, just over an hour, what we're going to do is we're going to have a presentation of the key findings from the kind of overall research. We're going to be led through that by our brilliant research manager, Emma James, who's led on this research for us. As many of you will know, but for those who don't, the Britain Talks Climate and Nature project is a partnership between Climate Outreach and More in Common, with the very generous support from the European Climate Foundation. The kind of data and insight is built on a segmentation model, which has been led by More in Common. And so we're then, after we've kind of heard about the key findings, we'll have some time for some questions on the key findings. And then we're going to go back and hear a little bit more about those 7 segments, some new segments to get our head round this year, and a bit of a deep dive into what some of those 7 segments are really thinking and feeling about climate and nature right now, and some of the best ways that we can kind of engage with them. We won't be able to cover all of the segments. We won't be able to cover all the detail. We won't be able to cover all the questions you have. We know that. But as I said, please get in touch with us. We'd love to continue the conversation after the webinar today. So the people that you will hear from in the course of the next kind of hour and a bit, as I said, Emma is our research manager. She's going to talk you through the findings. When we get into a bit more of the deep dive into the segments, it's great that we're joined by Ed Hodgson, who's the Deputy Director of Research at More in Common, and he'll be taking us through the kind of segments in a bit more detail. And Emma and Ed will be joined in the kind of Q&A sessions by Nikki Hawkins, who is a communications consultant and has been doing an awful lot of work with Climate Outreach, thinking about our narratives and messaging and framing. We will ask you to kind of drop some questions in the Q&A, but we'd ask you to hold those back until after Emma's gone through her presentation, and then we'll take some of those questions and get into a bit of a discussion once we've kind of talked you through the main headline findings. With that, Emma, I will hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see so many of you here. As Rachel said, I'm Emma James, Research Manager at Climate Outreach, and I'm so proud to have led on the research behind this Britain Talks Climate and Nature project. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you our key findings and lots of the insight that we've been finding in this project. So we wanted to start today with our 3 key findings. So 3 things to know. The first, we are a nation of nature lovers and we want to protect our environment. So we saw this come through so strongly in this research. People from all walks of life care more deeply than we realise. We're really proud of the ways that we're already protecting and restoring our environment, from national parks to woodlands and even proud of things like wind farms and solar farms. We're happy when we're in nature. People are worried about harm coming to nature and wildlife. And with the vast majority of us appreciate and respect nature, and it's a unifying frame. But trust in society, politics, and governments is collapsing. People feel overlooked, disillusioned about the present, fearful for the future, and many are yet to be convinced that net zero offers a positive way forward. And this felt like a real key kind of weave through this research, is this distrust in society and politics in general, and really influencing how people are thinking and feeling about climate and nature right now. And third, climate action has an image problem, but it is fixable. So although we're feeling that climate change and net zero is talking about these things is becoming more polarizing, in fact, we're seeing that people support strong, ambitious leadership on climate action, and we support our progress towards clean energy, and we're seeing that across Britain. Audiences need to see and feel the positive progress that's already underway, and really hear about how this progress can tangibly make life and the future better. They need to feel that it is possible and that everyone can play a part in that. We also wanted to share some strategic recommendations right up top. So the first, translate and explain, don't assume and assert. So people across the board are with us when our communication is clear and inviting. We see when we change the story and change the messaging, it really does influence how people are thinking and feeling about this and the support for climate action. We see huge increases in support for action when we explain why it matters and what it means for people's lives. Secondly, inspire a better future, show why tackling climate change leads to good things for us all. We need to talk much more about the better future we're trying to create through simple, clear stories, and how tackling climate change helps us to improve other aspects of our lives, especially at the local level and in very tangible ways. So celebrating the stories of progress, what's already happening, especially in the local area. And finally, don't take support for granted, but don't misinterpret or overestimate opposition. So people from all walks of life have concerns about the cost and the politics of net zero, but this doesn't mean that they are not concerned about climate change or that they're opposed to action to protect the environment. So I'll now introduce Britain Talks Climate and Nature in a bit more detail, and then we'll go through some of the evidence and data behind these 3 key findings in a bit more detail. So what is Britain Talks Climate and Nature? This is our resource for engaging the British public on climate change and nature. It exists to help us better understand and engage with people's priorities, their questions, their concerns, and it helps us to tell those clearer, more compelling climate stories that we know are so crucial and that resonate with people of different values and backgrounds. And so, as Rachel said, we have this online resource, which is an in-depth analysis, so an insights report, as well as a communications toolkit, full of in-depth analysis, insights, recommendations, strategic implications for anyone that wants to talk about climate change with people across Britain and really understand what they're thinking and feeling about these topics right now. Underpinning Britain Talks Climate and Nature are the 7 British segments, so created by More in Common, as mentioned. I won't dwell on these too much now. As Rachel mentioned, we will come onto these in a bit more detail later on in the webinar. But what's really brilliant about using this segmentation from More in Common for Britain Talks Climate and Nature is it provides that shared and strategic understanding of the British public and identifies ways to engage across the whole of society on climate change and nature. So we'll come back to these in a little while. In terms of our research methods behind this project, so what we did, so the first thing to say is that this is one of the most extensive research projects that we've done as part of our Britain Talks Climate and Nature work. We started right at the beginning of the year in January with a stakeholder scoping phase. So we talked to lots of people across the sector and beyond, really digging into and getting under the skin of the challenges and opportunities that people are facing right now when it comes to engagement and communications on climate change. We really wanted to understand how can we make Britain Talks Climate and Nature as useful as possible. And these conversations and this phase was fundamental in informing and shaping the research. We then ran nationally representative research. So we ran a 2,000 person survey and a 5,000 person survey. We also ran focus groups with each of the 7 British segments. We boosted our samples in Wales and Scotland. So we have representative samples across the 3 nations. I'll now go through some of our key evidence and data that shows an overview of our key findings, going through it based on those 3 key findings that I mentioned right at the top. So firstly, we are a nation of nature lovers and we want to protect our environment. So we heard from people when we're thinking about how they feel about climate change and how they feel about the impact that people have on the environment and the natural world. What we heard was people are worried, concerned, they're sad. They say things like negative, destroying. So it was really interesting to ask these open text questions because it really got to dig into what are the words that people associate with how they feel about these things. And we see that people are worried and concerned, and that's what came through strongest in these questions. We also see that people are very worried about climate change harming nature and wildlife. So when we asked which of the following impacts of climate change are you most worried about over the next 10 years, harm nature and wildlife came top across Brits by some margin, and then for most of the segments as well. For those segments where it didn't come top, it's a very close second. And this is the case across England, Scotland and Wales as well. So I sat in all the focus groups and nature came up time and time again. A person from the segment Rooted Patriot from Anglesey said, I'm concerned about the sewage into the rivers and the seas, and then also the heating up of the planet, the global warming as it were. So worry about nature, harm coming to nature, but also things like being concerned about litter and pollution in beauty spots came up so strongly in these discussions across England, Scotland and Wales. People are concerned about these things and they're worried about harm coming to nature and wildlife. We also saw pride in what we're already doing to protect the environment, so to restore and protect natural places in the UK. Things like planting trees, protecting national parks, conserving land. These came up top when we listed actions that we're already doing to support the environment and asked how proud people are of these. People are worried about climate change and they care more deeply than we realise. And again, as well as coming through very strongly about nature, we saw that people are worried about this and they really do care. So 74% of Brits think climate change is important. 64% of us are worried about it. Only 4% say they're not worried about climate change because they don't believe climate change is real. And 68% think we should be ambitious in our response to climate change. So we're worried about this and we're concerned about it. But often, a lot of people, what we're hearing is that they try not to think about it, or maybe they don't talk about it as much. And this can be for a number of reasons. So things like having lots of other concerns to worry about, or just trying not to worry about things in general. So we're concerned about it. We're seeing that people are worried about it, but maybe they're not thinking or talking about it as much. We also see strong support for our move towards clean energy. So many are proud of efforts that are often seen as more divisive. So things like building new wind and solar farms. 89% of Brits like or don't mind seeing solar panels on roofs. We saw this across Scotland and Wales as well. So people in Scotland are more proud of the offshore wind industry than the North Sea oil and gas industry. And in Wales, people are almost as proud as renewable energy projects as they are of their coal mining heritage. So we see this support, we see this pride for moving towards clean energy. On to our second key finding. So trust in society, politics and governments is collapsing, and climate policy is really being viewed through this lens. And certain politicians are capitalising on this. So we're seeing and hearing in groups and discussions and through the survey that people are disillusioned about the present and fearful for the future. So we asked what world people think future generations will inherit, and the top answers were uncertain and worried. So over half of Brits selected worried or uncertain. There is a real sense that government and big business have a vested interest and agenda in net zero policies. So this is something that came through in all of the focus groups we sat in, and we listened to people. There's a real distrust in politics, and that is linked to kind of lots of policy areas, all policy areas, including on climate and net zero. We heard things like worrying that these policies would just align people's pockets and create profit. There really is that kind of sense of leaders and governments, and in politics, there's a vested interests and agendas. And in particular, two audience segments, the traditional conservatives and dissenting disruptors, typically harder to engage on climate change and increasingly sceptical about that concept of net zero. And again, for them, this sort of idea of vested interests and agendas would come up time and time again in our discussions in focus groups. A participant from the segment Skeptical Scroller in Glasgow said, I think the government, they're almost hiding behind it all and scared to admit that there is a problem here. They're acting like they're all over it, but I don't think they actually know what they're doing. So there is this idea of kind of distrust really, really coming through, and that thought of kind of vested interests and agendas, and the trust is really weaved through how people are thinking and feeling about climate and nature. And a lot of this, again, is very linked to fears about costs and fairness. So fears about costs are potent and widespread, and people see deep unfairness in this. So even the more well-off audience segments wonder how they'll afford things like heat pumps and electric vehicles. There is a deep sense that people are just a bit fed up with broken promises and politicians who don't feel like they're there for people like them. So although there's this big kind of fears about costs, and these are widespread, there's also a really encouraging finding that we found is that few believe scrapping plans to tackle climate change will save them money. So although we did see that people think climate actions and policies will cost money, very few believed scrapping plans altogether to tackle climate change will save them money. A participant from the segment Traditional Conservative from Oxfordshire said, as UK citizens, we pay the most for our utility bills, for our gas and electricity, and the reason for that at the moment, really going for this net zero policy. Wind turbines are clearly a big part of that, and whilst they're a great green resource on one level, they're also very expensive. We're subsidising them through our utility bills. So we heard time and time again this worry about costs and really linked to net zero policy. So although we see support for things like wind turbines and solar panels, there is worry about cost in general around net zero. And again, this feels very linked to the thread of kind of distrust and feeling there's kind of vested interests and agendas. And when it comes to consultation and engagement by our leaders, so people want to have a say on local issues, but don't trust it will happen meaningfully. So almost half of Brits feel that consultation happening by national government is just a tick box exercise. So it's not meaningful. They won't have their voices heard meaningfully. In Scotland, people tend to have more confidence in local public consultation processes, but in general, people believe local communities should have more of a say, and 70% of Brits think it would be better for politicians to listen to the views of as many residents as possible, even if that slowed down the development process. So there is that want for kind of meaningful engagement that really listens to the voices on the local level. And on to our third and final key finding, climate action has an image problem, but it's fixable. So when you kind of zoom out and think about what we heard in the focus groups, there is a risk that climate action is becoming either about net zero or about activism, and neither of which are liked by people in general. So we really need to be something else in this. So a participant from the segment Dissenting Disruptor from Merthyr Tydfil said, I just think to myself, where are we going as a country now? We focus on all the doom and gloom. Nothing ever positive comes out of it. You turn the telly on and it's doom and gloom. And where are we going? What are we doing in terms of give us some light at the end of the tunnel on anything, even renewable energy or whatever? There's got to be some light out there. We felt that this was quite an instructive quote in terms of the kind of light at the end of the tunnel. Our job isn't about sugarcoating reality. It's really about offering something that we can all aim for in the future and that we can feel we've really kind of made progress towards. On the trust challenge as well, so this is very much linked to this image problem that we're talking about. So activists, green groups and experts have a trust challenge. People feel less trusting of those who are part of protests or activist groups. We also see a pervading general distrust of statistics. So again, in all of the focus groups, when we shared statistics on kind of progress on renewable energy, people didn't trust them. They thought they thought statistics could be molded to show anything that was wanted. So again, kind of linking back to that sort of agenda point. So we need to tell stories that illustrate these points instead, that show this progress. But what we do see is people are more trusting when messengers show credibility, passion, and empathy. So we ran some research last year in 2024 that looked into trust a bit more, and we found that the three key pillars of trustworthiness are credibility, passion, and empathy. And this came through again in this research this year. So in Britain Talks Climate and Nature, we saw that the kind of characteristics that people trust more to talk about climate change are really linked to this credibility, passion, and empathy. And we see a growing distrust in net zero policies, but people still think it will be good for the UK. So we do feel that, talking about net zero and climate change feels increasingly polarising. But in fact, in Scotland, twice as many people thought that net zero would be a good thing for the UK than a bad. More people in Wales think that net zero will be positive for Welsh industry. More people think net zero will be good for the UK than bad, but this is lower than in 2024. So we do see that kind of growing distrust, although people still think it will be good for the UK. And so on the point of it being fixable, it is fixable. We have the vast majority of people with us, but we rarely project the confidence and appeal of a winning team. We are in a fight now. We need to keep building support, not risk driving people away. So we see strong support for ambitious leadership on climate and action, on climate and nature. We presented the statement, commits to and delivers on ambitious climate policies, even if people say they won't be possible. And the majority see this as a sign of a strong leader. We can start to see here on this graph where some of the differences occur across the segments. So some of the more harder to reach segments on, or harder to engage segments on climate change, traditional conservatives, dissenting disruptors, they are less likely to see this as a sign of a strong leader. So this is where we can start to see where we can tailor some of our engagement and communications to really reach these people. But in general, the majority see this as a sign of a strong leader. People are very supportive of the UK's move towards clean energy. So we've talked a little bit about clean energy already, but people are very positive towards clean energy. Only 11% don't like seeing solar panels on roofs. Only 15% don't like seeing wind turbines in the countryside. And this support is the case across the political spectrum. So 74% of those intending to vote Reform and 74% of those intending to vote Conservative either like or don't mind seeing wind turbines in the countryside. Again, across Wales and Scotland, more people in Wales feel the transition away from coal was a good thing. Most people in Scotland were likely to say they don't mind seeing pylons in the countryside. So we see this strong support for our move towards clean energy. And actually, when we present stories of progress, people find this compelling. So instead of stories of failure or stories of radical change, people find it compelling when we celebrate the progress already underway with clean energy. And on solar panels in particular, solar panels have a potential to be a powerful symbol of our collective effort and progress. When people either generally like seeing them or generally don't mind either way, the majority of people feel this. In focus groups, we heard people say one question why solar panels weren't being put on more roofs and more buildings. For those that had them, they were a source of pride, and for some people that didn't, a source of envy. And so with all that in mind, what does this mean for our communications and engagement on climate change and nature? So we've summed this up here. So in this research, we really lent into and did a lot of message testing, language testing, narrative testing. We really wanted to get under the skin of how to talk to people about this in a way that's compelling and effective. And we saw huge effects when we changed the message. How we changed the story really makes a difference, and we really saw this come through in this research. So firstly, we need to talk to everyone. The message framing that we found worked in this research is protecting the environment rather than leading with climate change. And when it comes to cost, talking about investing in a more prosperous society and a better future for everyone. We need to foreground people's care for nature. We know this is unifying. We know the vast majority of us appreciate and respect nature. And we need to build on the widespread but often quiet British concern and desire for action. Next, inviting people into and selling a better future and building stronger support for policy and leadership. So we need to talk about that progress already made. So we've talked about this already, but really thinking about those stories of progress. How do we celebrate this and show people that we're already making that progress? We need to connect net zero to what it's for and what it does. So when you talk to people about what it's for and why it matters, the response you get is very different. Invest in a better future without trashing the past. So although we see strong support for our move towards clean energy, we also see that people don't tend to feel ashamed of the fossil fuel industry and are in fact worried about people who work in them. So instead of kind of trashing the past, we really need to be focusing on investing in that better future. And finally, the stories we need more of are those of tangible local benefits. So really showing what this means for people tangibly on the local level. Tangible local benefits, things like solar panels on local sports clubs' roofs, or better public transport, cycle lanes and green space to improve health and happiness. Really digging into that, what it tangibly means for people on the local level. So just to share an example on that, we presented a net zero target from a council, so testing hypothetical support for this, so getting to net zero by 2045. We then presented that same target and added things like cleaner energy supply and new jobs. And what we saw is an increase in support from 50% to 64%. And this was particularly the case for the traditional Conservatives and dissenting disruptors, so those segments typically harder to engage on climate. We see support increase when we connect net zero to what it's for and what it does, and really talking about those local tangible benefits to people. And then just a final example, talking about progress already underway, we presented the stat on how the UK's electricity is made from renewables, how much of the UK's electricity is made from renewables, and asked how that made people feel. And the word cloud here is what you can see, what we heard. So it was good, surprised, better, positive, hopeful, happy. So people find it compelling when we talk about progress already made, and we really need to be thinking about those stories. Again, when we tested different messaging, more than 2/3 found stories of progress that we tested compelling. So we know that this works for people. So just to sum that all up, when we ditch the doom and alienating language, connect with people, talk about progress already made and how addressing climate change can tackle cost of living concerns, we can bring people with us. And finally, just to go back to those 3 key findings from the top. So we are a nation of nature lovers and we want to protect our environment, but trust in society, politics and governments is collapsing. Climate action has an image problem, but it is fixable. I'm now going to hand back to Rachel, and I think we'll have some time for some questions on all of that.
Emma, thank you so much. That was great. And thank you all for the questions that have already started to come in. Please do keep adding your questions in here. So there are a number of questions that I can see have already been kind of posted, getting into some of the questions on the segments. I'm going to leave those for now because we are going to have a bit more of a conversation about the segmentation and the new segments. So hopefully some of those will be answered in that. And if they're not, then I'll come back and pick through those kind of specific questions on the segments in a few moments' time. So there are a number of questions posted here about kind of terms we use. Do we need new terms for ESG and net zero? Should we stop talking about net zero? What should we say instead of net zero? So Nikki, I'm going to ask if you can take a kind of response to some of those questions. Sorry, I should have said there are a number of questions in here just about kind of sharing of the findings and the slides. As I said, this webinar is being recorded. We will post a link on our website to a recording, but all of the information that you've seen presented today is contained in our report and the toolkit on our website. So if you'd like to kind of sit with it and look at the detail in a bit more detail, I would really encourage you to go and do that via our website. So yes, Nikki, if you can come back on some of the questions about kind of net zero. And then there are also some questions coming through, particularly around kind of local new build on renewables. So local opposition and kind of what we know and what we've heard about that. So if I maybe ask Emma and then Ed to come in with a few thoughts on the kind of local renewables point. But Nikki, if I can ask you to respond to some of the questions specifically on the kind of terminology to kick us off.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Emma, for that wonderful run through. So this question of net zero in particular was something we really dug into in the research, and we did some messaging experiments to compare how people respond to different ways of framing net zero. And what we found is that when we talked about net zero as a sort of council target in a fairly stark and technical way, 50% of people said they supported it. When we presented it with a basic explanation of what that means, that rose to 64%. And when we added in a vision of better, so when we talked about local climate policy that benefits people's health and happiness, protects local nature, and makes us work towards a sustainable future, 78% of people said they felt positive about that. So we really are in danger with net zero of presenting people with a technical term that doesn't offer them any sense of what or why that is. I don't think we should be ditching the term altogether, but I think we need to always bear in mind that we are selling a brownie, not a recipe. We are offering people something. We are talking about what this means in practice and why it's a good thing, rather than the more kind of technical or academic or theoretical, and certainly that's how it comes across to people, side of the argument. And I think that is incumbent on us in this moment to really listen to actually that strong support. 78% of people feel positive about it when we say what it is and why it's for. Like, we've just got to keep doing that as much as we can. I realise in doing that we are somewhat cheating, because we're comparing the effects of a short snappy term with a long list of good things. So I think it's up to us again to think about how we tailor messages. Who are we talking to? What are we trying to achieve with a particular piece of communication, and what do we need to emphasise? But I feel really encouraged by this research in terms of like the potential to unpack and actually explain and offer something people better, rather than getting locked in something that feels very unclear and opaque to people.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nikki. So yeah, there are a number of questions that have been posed. Some of them are about kind of some of the specifics around renewables, but some, I guess, are about kind of how people think and feel about new renewables. If I maybe could come to Ed first and then to Emma about kind of what we heard and what we think it means, I guess, for kind of communication and engagement around new renewable energy.
Yeah, great. I mean, I don't think it would be a surprise to many people here, but like often the findings on this sort of research are that there's often a very loud minority who are very vocal in opposition to, for example, a new renewable project, and a very sort of quiet majority who are more ambivalent and don't care. And like Emma pointed out in her talk, like there's actually lots of pride that people feel when people see renewables in the countryside, and we can sort of lean into that more and be a little bit confident. The issue is, and I think a lot of the research sort of almost on any topic at the moment comes down to this, is that sort of trust in our leaders is low, and people will say, and they did say in focus groups, like, I don't understand why we need to build a solar panel on the farm next to me when we're not putting solar panels on the roofs on new build houses. It's this sort of common sense test, but priorities aren't right. So a lot of it does come down to trust. People will support new renewables local to them, but only if they sort of trust the people promising those developments to be acting in their interests. I would say just one more thing on this is that thankfully, and the opportunity here is that trust in local leaders has survived much better than trust in our national leaders and sort of the fall of trust. So we've done word clouds before where we've asked, how would you describe Britain in a word? And then we've asked, how would you describe your local area in a word? And when you ask to describe Britain in a word, you get broken, expensive, struggling, rubbish. That's a very gloomy word cloud. If you ask people to describe their local area, they say nice, quiet, community. And that's the opportunity, I think, sort of build on some local, really rooted stories and have some authentic messengers making the case that this will benefit people locally. I think then you can rebuild trust that the people proposing these developments are acting in people's interests.
Great, thank you, Ed. Emma, I wonder if there's anything to build on from you. And there was also a really specific question, which was kind of, does some of the answer to this lie with community? So I wonder if you could kind of take that as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And yeah, thank you, Ed. I completely agree on the point on trust, because I think for a lot of the segments, it might be that we need to kind of pass the mic to those kind of local community leaders and people trusted in the community that know the experience and context of the community, and even maybe experiencing climate impacts themselves, or things like being in jobs that are changing and things like that. So really leaning into where people trust those to talk about this on the local level. One thing I wanted to pick up on is, in focus groups, we heard about from people that might live near wind farms and things like that. And there was often a kind of concern that they hadn't been consulted. And actually, I think when we have meaningful, genuine consultation that is really, really thought about and actually feels genuine to people, not just a tick box exercise, there's like much more support. And we know that there's support for this move towards clean energy and renewable energy, but we need to make sure we have a genuine consultation to hear what people think, especially on the local level. And then with community in general, I think I would go back again to that point on trust. And I think people need to see the tangible local benefits to their community. A lot of the segments in particular will look very much through a local lens when it comes to climate and nature, and really seeing what those benefits are to the community in particular. And I think leaning into that point on trust and having local trusted messengers to talk about that, and that have actually experienced that as well. So if people are talking about having solar panels on their roofs and are really enjoying it, that's a really trusted messenger to talk about this.
Thank you, Emma. I'm struggling to keep up with the questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for how many you were putting in. People who are asking very specific and detailed questions, we're not going to get to those. But as I've said, please do get in touch with us. And if we can help to kind of follow up on some of your specific questions, then we'd really like to. And as I said, we will come back to some of the kind of segmentation questions in a few moments. I'm just going to answer one question that was posted about kind of how we're kind of reaching parliamentarians with this. Thank you. It's a great question. So we have been really trying to make sure that all of the political parties kind of are briefed on and understand the findings from this report. We've had some really encouraging conversations from a number of representatives from different political parties. We've also had some really good conversations with a number of the civil servants in kind of DESNES and DEFRA and other places. But really, yeah, like kind of we want to make sure that anybody who's thinking about kind of communications or storytelling on climate or on nature has seen these recommendations and seen these insights and feel that they might be able to use them. So I think we'll maybe do kind of another 3 questions, and then I'm going to kind of move us on to thinking about the segmentation in a little bit more detail. So Nikki, another question for you. This is a bit of a tricky one, but I'm sure you're up to it. Could we give any examples of effective climate comms or campaigns that kind of we think have been effective? So kind of how we can put kind of some of these recommendations into practice. So I'll let you answer that, and I'll just pick out a couple of others to put to Emma and Ed before we move on to kind of talking through some of the segmentation.
Great question. So I'm going to go for a couple of different examples. Firstly, I think the Climate Coalition have been doing a fantastic job of really normalizing concern and normalizing the desire for action that exists across our society. So talking about this as something that is a priority to people, something that is important to people from all walks of life, and showing solutions that are already underway. So big up the Climate Coalition. On a different kind of extreme, I think the Earthshot Prize, Prince William's initiative, is a really good example of centering solutions. So showing what's possible, centering the idea of kind of human ingenuity, centering the idea of kind of people-powered stories and people-powered action at a global level. So I think that those two combined both in terms of the kind of types of solutions, the types of ingenuity and innovation we need, and the type of kind of participation in democracy we need to address this are both really kind of well exhibited by those two examples.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nikki, so much. And then there's a couple of, well, there's a number of questions here about kind of trust and distrust. And it was such a kind of prevalent sort of theme of the research. So I'm going to ask a couple of these before we kind of go back into some further presentation. So first of all, if you could take this one, Ed, if there's a sense of distrust increasing, kind of how are people responding to that? Is that people kind of taking things into their own hands, or is it just a kind of sense of kind of paralysis and despair? And Emma, another question on trust, which is kind of who are the trusted messengers? You know, if we're seeing that there is kind of greater skepticism, particularly around politicians, who are people talking about in terms of trusted to be effective communicators on this? So Ed, to you first, please.
Great. Yeah, I would say the growing distrust, I mean, it has so many negative consequences, unfortunately. And for example, like we've done lots of research, even as part of this, on electric vehicles. And when people think that big companies aren't acting in their interest, they start to think that electric vehicles might just be sort of a scam to rip people off, for example. And I mean, I think that's also another interesting element, which is that we've had very well reported falling trust in politicians, but falling trust in business is sort of just as severe and actually has just as many implications, because obviously businesses will be a part of the climate transition. If people don't trust EV companies, that's an equally big problem. So there's one thing which is like, it just sort of switches people off and it leads them to sort of become apathetic towards all of this. I mean, if I was to sort of suggest a moment of like optimism or a way that sort of at the very least it can be used, is that I think some of the more sort of populisty climate messages can be effective in that environment. So it's possible to say that like, oh yeah, the sort of these companies, like they are polluting the environment, like they won't necessarily protect us. Obviously not EV companies, but the more polluting companies. People will listen to those, but like I say, you don't want to reinforce the you can't trust anyone narrative, because that's not helpful. So yeah, maybe this is where sort of Emma's answer will be helpful, in that like building on the people who people do trust, who tend to be people close to people, local communities, more known, familiar faces, is the way out of that. But yeah, I would say that the low trust is toxic, not just to the climate debate, but more generally.
Thanks, Ed. Emma.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. So one thing to say is we have a whole chapter on trust and leadership in the report, so please do go and take a look at that. I think that, so on kind of who are the trusted communicators. So one thing to point out is, of course, David Attenborough came up a lot in our focus groups, and he is that kind of beacon of kind of British expertise, passion, empathy, and leadership in this, and that's really linked to kind of what we've been saying about nature coming out through this research so much as well. But we really wanted to kind of go past the sort of list of trusted messengers and really try to dig into those kind of characteristics and think about what is trusted to people. And so what we're kind of seeing is trusted for people to kind of talk about climate change is, you know, experience working on the topic, but also things like having an understanding of what life is like for normal Britons, and then also kind of speaking in a language that's easy to understand and are passionate about tackling climate change. So we have that kind of credibility, passion, and empathy coming through so much, and it really is that kind of pyramid of the trustworthiness that we need, is that we have that credibility and people see that as trustworthy, but what's really important is that we show that empathy and passion as well. So it's kind of a three-pronged solution to our trusted messengers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. As I said, the questions are fantastic and plentiful. I'm sorry we can't get to more of them. If you've asked us specific questions about does your research cover X, I would really encourage you to go and check out the detail on the website and in our communications toolkit, because hopefully the answer to quite a lot of those questions is yes. If there are specifics that you'd like to follow up on, you can find our contact details on our website, but drop us a note, info@climateoutreach.org, and we will kind of see what we can do. But now I'm going to hand over to Ed, who's going to talk to us about the new segmentation. As I said, There were a number of comments about the kind of research methodology and the segmentation. So hopefully Ed, and then moving on to Emma's presentations now, will answer a few of those, and we'll have kind of another 5 or 10 minutes at the end just to pick up on a few more questions before we wrap up. So Ed, over to you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so I'm from More in Common. We are an organisation who do lots of public opinion research on all sorts of issues, particularly the ones which are either where we want to understand basically what shapes people's views on them, and climate change is a really important focus for us. And we develop these segments basically to help people better understand how to reach different audiences on climate change, and to understand why people think what they do think on climate change. So if we look at this slide, some of you here, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with our old segments. We created those in 2020. A lot has changed since then, and the segments were in need of an update. We think our new segments are better at understanding sort of the current dynamics in the climate debate, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment. But just to give us sort of a top line overview, these are segments where we asked 20,000 people a range of issues about their social psychology, their worldviews, their beliefs. We don't put into the segmentation any demographic questions, so people are not being segmented based on their age or gender or ethnicity. It's just all to do with how they see the world and what they want from the world. So if you look on the right, here are sort of some of the key psychological theories that go into it. One is moral foundations theory. That's always been the core of our segmentation values, as is perceived threat. So some people who are more alert to threat in the world, for example, are more likely to be worried about things like the impacts of climate change. People who have a lower threat perception are more optimistic, might be sort of more willing to engage with the climate sort of discussions through the lens of climate technology and more optimistic futures like that. We ask about parenting style, which is a really interesting way to get at people's values relating to sort of how much comfort they have with the sort of the state getting involved in some of these solutions. And then interestingly, new for our new segmentation, there's lots of questions about what's called in the social psychology literature need for chaos. So basically, there's some people who want to sort of adapt, incrementally change, and sort of preserve the status quo. And there's some people who are more comfortable with sort of tearing down the system and having sort of chaos around them. And attitudes on this really reflect sort of people's inclinations towards more populist, sort of more outlandish solutions, both pro and anti-climate change, I should say. And then there's lots of questions about personal agency and responsibility, and people who think that people have very high agency are less likely to support sort of stronger government intervention on some things like this, and people who are more likely to think that sort of, for example, people's success is due to forces outside of their control, much more likely to think that the government can do much more on this. I should say there's much more on this, and more importantly, actually, for this segmentation, we asked a lot more questions than last time about trust in experts and online engagement, which are obviously really important in 2025 for understanding attitudes. Lots of people always ask how they can find out what segment they are. If you just Google 7 segments quiz, you can take the quiz and find out your own segment too. So if we go to the next slide, I won't spend too long going over all of these segments. You can read much more about all of them on the website, but I will just give a brief overview, and then Emma's going to go into a bit more detail on some specific ones. But very broadly speaking, progressive activists are maybe the easiest to understand. They sort of do what they say on the tin. Interestingly, progressive activists, I will point out, are essentially the only segment for whom politics is important to their identity. And they're also the only segment who are more likely to enjoy than not like talking about politics. So the one thing that's unique for this group is they're basically very political, and political arguments really sort of appeal to them. They're obviously left-wing, concerned about things like social justice, and have a very global mindset on issues like climate change. Then you have the incrementalist left, who share a lot of the values of progressive activists, but they don't have the same sort of tear down the system mentality. They're much more sort of trusting of our current institutions. They actually are the highest trust group in institutions like the BBC, for example. And they are much more sort of willing to sort of build on what we have, and are generally more optimistic. They're also quite disengaged from the news, unlike progressive activists. One of our sort of working titles for this group, which obviously we wouldn't use publicly, but we were thinking of them as sort of like the happy disengaged, in that they tend to think the system is working broadly well for them, but they see little joy or need to follow the news closely. And then we have established liberals. who are sort of the most financially comfortable group. They are sort of economically very much pro-free market, but socially quite progressive on climate change. They're very willing to talk about climate technology, and they're very excited about that as a way out. Skeptical scrollers are sort of a very new group. I think of this group as the group that only exists because of the COVID pandemic. They spend lots of time online. They're very sort of distrusting of institutions and the government. And they are sort of much more likely to say in focus groups that they want to sort of do their own research and find their own truth about these things. They're not climate deniers. They're not, climate skepticism is not really a mainstream view in the UK, but they're much more likely to sort of be what they would say like sort of open-minded about different ways out. And they don't necessarily have strong views either way, although generally they're fairly supportive of a lot of climate messaging. Rooted patriots, they are sort of your sort of quintessential sort of red wall, if you want to use that archetype. They're very high threat perception, which makes them very alert to sort of the risks and threats of climate change. They're actually quite supportive of a lot of climate measures, and they're patriotic, so they like the messages that sort of land on sort of the pride in the efforts that Britain has done so far. Traditional conservatives, strong respect for authority and tradition is their main sort of lens on the world. They're very, very sort of rules-based, if you want to think of them like that. High trust in our institutions, which is unlike dissenting disruptors who are also very conservative on social issues, but do not trust our institutions. This is sort of the Nigel Farage reform base, and they score very highly on need for chaos and tearing down a lot of our institutions. This is sort of the most climate skeptical segment, although I should say they still tend to sort of like a lot of the stuff we've done on renewables to date. That's a very quick overview. Like I said, there's much more on the website. You can read about them. Just to show one more slide, which I quite like, to show why we do this segment work in the first place. I think someone was asking in the Q&A about whether we asked about generation and age. And of course we do. And there are some interesting sort of trends by age on climate attitudes. But actually, if you look at here on the left, the proportion of people saying they're worried about climate change, it's more or less flat by age. So young people are just as likely to say they're worried about climate change as older people. So doing that sort of demographic-based analysis only gets you so far, whereas the segment-based analysis, you can see much more variation. And if you're trying to think about sort of the comms strategy, knowing if you're talking to progressive activists and rooted patriots who are very worried about climate change, you're going to sort of have a slightly different approach to if you're talking about some of the groups who are less worried about climate change. And at the same time, using the segments help us not to see sort of how worried they are about climate change, but because we've got that psychological underpinning, we can start to think about why they might be worried. So, for example, progressive activists and the incrementalist left might be thinking about sort of the impact of climate change on sort of inequality in the country. As rooted patriots are much more likely to think about sort of the impact of climate threats on their children and grandchildren. So yeah, that's like a nice slide that shows a bit more why we take this approach. And Emma's going to give some more examples now.
Thanks so much, Ed, for that brilliant overview. So now the plan is just to go through a few of the segments in a bit more detail based on kind of thinking about engaging them on climate and nature. So this slide gives you you can see all the segments here. So we've thought about, of course, where these segments are at on climate and nature. So through Britain Talks Climate and Nature, we've delved into and explored what these 7 segments think and feel about climate and nature. So we can then ultimately understand how best to engage with them and connect with their values. The green text on this slide are our sort of climate one-liners that we've created through digging into the research and really kind of listening to these segments in focus groups to try and sum up where these segments are at when it comes to climate and climate change and nature. And one thing just to flag is on our communications toolkit on the Britain Talks Climate and Nature website, we've got lots of segment-specific communications recommendations as well. So please do go and take a look, and there's kind of different themes that you might be talking about, and then you can have a look at how you might tailor that for different segments. So, for example, here, progressive activists, they want climate action to make the world a better place. So as Ed's really expertly summed up, progressive activists very worried about climate change. They want urgent action, concerned about climate change causing hardship to those most vulnerable. And in general, they want to make the world a better place. So they can be idealistic, radical, and uncompromising in this. Another example with the established Liberals, so believe we're moving in the right direction on climate through a mix of technology, innovation and global cooperation. So this segment, worried and concerned about climate change, but optimistic about the future, favour moving quickly and ambitiously on climate change, and again, as Ed pointed out, optimistic that new technology will make society better. And then a final example on this slide, the dissenting disruptors. So while they recognise the need to tackle climate change, they believe the system is rigged and it's leaving them behind. So they do think climate is an important issue, but they're less worried and think about it less than others. They're suspicious of national and international climate action. They have those low trust levels that Ed was mentioning and fairness concerns. So for them, they might think that there's one set of rules for the rich and one for the poor, as they might put it. So we have these kind of climate sort of summaries to see where these segments are at on climate and nature. And what we just wanted to do for the next couple of minutes is give a bit of a deep dive into engaging 3 of the segments on climate change. So we know there's kind of lots of bigger strategic questions on which segments to target, but we're not going to be getting into that today. But we'd love to kind of hear from you and work with you more on that. But what we really wanted to do was think about some examples of how we engage these segments in particular on climate change. So exploring these 3 segments in terms of engagement. So incrementalist left, highly concerned about climate change and supportive of the energy transition, but prefer a less radical approach to climate action. The rooted patriots, worried about climate change and want to see action taken, but are not convinced by climate leadership and are concerned about fairness in the climate transition. And traditional conservatives, less concerned about climate change and more opposed to net zero, but receptive to arguments about protection of our natural environment. So to start with, the incrementalist left believe in communities and leaders working together on climate change to improve the status quo. So what we're seeing in terms of engaging this segment is celebrating the action communities are already taking, like planting trees, leaving the car at home, and celebrating the leadership in communities that needs to be replicated nationally. So we see that this segment is very civically engaged and community oriented. They already tend to adopt certain low carbon behaviours at home, so they would be the most likely to buy local foods and cut down on food waste. So we can really celebrate that progress and what's already happening with this segment. And then we can show how we can keep building on our progress to create a better future for our children and grandchildren. So again, we've touched a little bit on kind of the framing of future generations, but the segment's worried about the future for young people. So we can kind of lean into that and talk about that a bit more in our engagement. Next, the rooted patriots, proud of Britain's past and their community. They want a climate future they can be proud of. In terms of engagement, we can talk about how protecting our environment means protecting our cherished local places and livelihoods. We can talk about how we support British farmers and protect local nature, as well as the benefits to our communities and future generations. So we know this segment's proud of Britain's history and nostalgic about the past. They care about putting Britain first and maintaining British culture. So that's where we can really think about, supporting British farmers, local nature, cherishing local places. They're proud of our natural spaces. They're pro net zero and favour ambitious action, but they're not convinced by climate leadership. So that's where we can think about passing the mic to a trusted messenger. That might be a local person on the local level, person with experience of change as a result of climate action. So we can really think about where it is that might be trusted for this segment. And then finally, the traditional conservatives, they believe in respecting the environment, but worry that climate action is overbearing and unfair. So they are hardest to engage on climate, but how we've been seeing in the research that we can engage them is talking about how protecting our environment protects a British way of life. Again, this segment is nostalgic and worried about a decline in respect for tradition. So we can really think about that kind of British way of life and how we can protect that in our engagement. They're the least worried and emotional about climate. They're not reassured by net zero or government action, but they do talk about kind of respect for the environment a lot in focus groups. So we can talk about how acting on climate change is about safeguarding and respecting the things we hold dear, like our natural world and farming livelihoods. And just as an example, so we heard this kind of thinking about respect for the environment as just being something that is typical and we should be doing it from this segment in focus group. So a participant from this segment in Oxfordshire said, I try and do the best I can. I don't litter. I will take my litter home. I won't just toss it out the car. And I've always done that because that's how I was brought up. And it was about respect. Respect for other people, respect for yourself, hence respect for the planet and the environment that you live in. And for me, this is something that really stuck with me because that kind of respect for the planet just came through so strongly from this segment. And it feels really like a way in for them in terms of our engagement and communications. So those are just a kind of 3 segments where we wanted to share a bit of a kind of snippet of what we're seeing in terms of how best to engage with them on climate and nature. We, of course, have 4 other segments, and we didn't have time to go into all of them today. But as I said, we'd love to talk to you more about engaging all of these. So please do get in touch with us and we can work with you on that. I'm now going to pass back to Rachel again, and we have a little bit of time left for some more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Ed. So yeah, we've got about another kind of 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm gonna try and pick up on a few questions, and then we'll wrap up maybe in about sort of 10 minutes. So Ed, there was a specific question to you about the kind of need for chaos present in the progressive activist segment, which I think is a really kind of interesting point. So if I could ask you to take that one. Emma, there was a question actually kind of raised at the beginning, which I think Ed sort of partly covered, but there was a really important question about kind of diaspora communities and how they were kind of involved or represented in this research. And then Nikki, if I could ask you to take the question about kind of behaviour change. So the specific question was, which segment think behaviour change is necessary or even essential? So I'll come to Ed and then to Emma and then Nikki.
Great. I'm so pleased you asked about need for chaos, because that's one of my favorite things to talk about. Yeah, I mean, need for chaos is a slightly dramatic way of putting it, to be honest, because what we're really asking is like how comfortable are people with quite significant change happening quite quickly around them. So traditional conservatives tend not to be comfortable with that. They tend to become more comfortable when things stay the same and sort of there's more calmness. The interesting thing about progressive activists is that they have basically, alongside dissenting disruptors, the highest need for chaos. So progressive activists and dissenting disruptors have completely different views on almost every issue you ask them about. You ask them about climate change, a lot of the time they say different things, but you ask them about immigration, there's completely different views. And if you ask them about sort of even like which party they might vote for, you can imagine it's completely different. But they both have very high need for chaos. And they both actually at the same time have a bit more sort of willingness to sort of paint all elites with the same brush. So I guess for progressive activists, that manifests itself in sort of we need radical climate action now, and we need to sort of move faster and quicker with climate change, and they're more willing to say that sort of the Labour government at the moment aren't doing enough on climate change, and they're more likely now, I think, to be voting for the Green Party than the Labour Party. With the dissenting disruptors, the need for chaos is basically a lot of those people have voted Conservative all their life, but they were the first people to move and jump ship to Reform because they're the most willing to vote for sort of a newer, fresher party. Whereas actually, if you think about traditional Conservative voters, they have a very low need for chaos, and they don't like the idea of voting for a new party because they see it as risky and their risk tolerance is much lower. On climate change, it manifests itself, I would say, dissenting disruptors in sort of, again, more willing to take radical action in either direction. And I think that quote Emma read out in the first half of the presentation from a dissenting disruptor sort of being like, we just need something. It's something that sort of resonates with lots of them. They just want to see something being done, basically. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed. Emma.
Thank you. Yeah, and great question. So I would say in research in general, we tried to kind of overrepresent different demographics, so things like ethnicities, religions, that kind of thing, to really make sure we're having that representation. In terms of the segment, so in More in Common's Shattered Britain report, there's lots of detail on kind of ethnicity representation across the segments and religion. Ed, you might be able to say a little bit more about that. But we, especially in focus groups, we really tried to make sure that we have a representative sample of who we're talking to. And we do that kind of across our research, but including in Britain Talks Climate and Nature. But yeah, Ed, you might want to add a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, just on a demographic breakdown, if you go to the Shattered Britain report, which I can put in the Q&A somewhere, the very last chapter basically just goes through every demographic of all the segments. So you can look at by ethnicity, by social grade, by region, by age, and you can see how they all pan out, basically.
Brilliant. Thanks both. Nikki.
So on the question of behaviour change and which of the segments are most willing to engage in that, we see willingness to be part of change across the segments. So people talk about things that they're doing, things that they'd like to be able to do across all segments, I would say, even those segments that we may feel are less easy to engage. And really interestingly, one of the lowest priorities for climate policy is that it kind of minimizes things we have to do in our own lifestyle, like in our own lives. So there is little sense that people do not want to be kind of part of the change. For me, the big challenge here is that whilst people are up for being part of change, they cannot feel that the onus is entirely on them, that this is something that they are being tasked with doing in an individual capacity, often feeling that they don't have the resource or the time or the ability to do the things that are being kind of expected or imposed on them. This has to be collective. It has to feel like something that is being led and being resourced at a systemic level. People are up for playing their part, but they really need to see that the world we live in, the context we operate in, is changing as well. So I would urge everyone, as far as we can, to not talk about behaviour change as if it's all on everyone, but to actually talk about how we're all up for playing our part, and we all want to be part of change, but we also expect and need leaders to make change possible for people at an individual level.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nikki. So we're running really close to the end of the session. Again, I'm really sorry that we haven't had a chance to answer more of your questions. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Please kind of find as many of kind of answers to some of your questions on our website, but do get in touch if there's more that we can do. I'd like to end by asking each of our three brilliant panelists the same question, which was kind of posed in the chat. I think it's a great one, which is for you, what was the biggest surprise in this research, or the biggest difference from when you've done kind of work like this before? So Nikki, you look like you're raring to go in terms of kicking us off. So I ask you to go first, and then Ed, and then Emma will give you the last word.
For me, the biggest surprise and the most heartening thing that we found as we dug through all the data was just how engaged in nature people are, and how galvanized they are by messaging that emphasizes our connection with nature. So there's a message we tested that talks about how we are dependent on nature for every breath we breathe and every mouthful of food we eat. And astonishing numbers of people found that message compelling. And for me, that highlights a real task for us, which is to integrate climate and nature as one big story, to talk about them in the same breath. For most people, they are part and parcel of the same thing. They aren't separate and distinct issues. And we have a huge opportunity. We have a kind of massively willing and engaged public. Even people who don't live close to nature appreciate, respect it, and want to hear and talk more about it and how we can protect it. So that felt really, really encouraging for me.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nikki. Ed.
Great. I feel like my mind on these questions always just goes to a focus group and a moment in a focus group. And the one that comes to me in this case was a lady, I think in Glasgow it was. She was a relatively old retired lady, and she was not that concerned about climate change. She was a bit worried about it, but she wasn't sort of like massively enthusiastic about renewables or things like that. But she said that a cycle lane had been put in outside her house and she doesn't cycle, but she now just feels much safer at night because there's people biking past, there's people around, and things are quieter. But she can still feel like there's people there if she goes walking at night, for example. And it was just like, it really struck me as like, there's always so many angles into talking about different climate policies, in this case transport policies, and like lots that haven't even been used there yet. And like the safety angle was just like a really interesting one that was I just thought really promising and a really nice way in for someone who otherwise might not be thinking about a lot of climate policies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed. Emma.
Yeah, great question. I would say for me, it was kind of seeing people's genuine desire to protect the environment. And I think, I think about that kind of traditional conservatives group and respecting the environment a lot as just like the norm. And if I may cheat a little bit and add a second one, it's that the overwhelming support for our progress with clean energy, and also just kind of feeling comfortable with it. So, liking or don't mind seeing solar panels on roofs and wind turbines in the countryside, that would felt so overwhelmingly, people support this and they feel comfortable with it.
Fantastic. So listen, thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for sticking with us throughout the whole webinar. Thank you for all the questions. We are really, really proud of this research, but it's only good if it's used. So please do have a look at it on our website. Please do interrogate the toolkit. Please do get in touch with us. Please do ask us questions. Please do tell us if you know where you think we haven't quite got it right. But kind of finish where I started. This is a tough time for people working on climate and nature. What we want to do is provide you with, I hope, a lot of source of kind of encouragement and hope. But the way we kind of go forward on this is together. So please, let's work together to put all these insights into practice, to find different creative ways of kind of talking about people's kind of quiet concern for climate and nature, and think about the kind of great stories that we can keep on telling together for the rest of this year and beyond. Thank you all very much, and hope to see you again soon.